In some of the world's densest cities, apartments without a single window or shaft of daylight routinely rent for 30 to 50% less than comparable sunlit units. These spaces aren't hidden or illegal. They exist openly in the market, priced precisely for their absence of light and air. This system is not driven by neglect, but by the predictable pressures of urban land scarcity, zoning frameworks, and cost optimization, turning daylight into a negotiable commodity within contemporary housing markets. How did we arrive at a point where a fundamental environmental quality became optional and discounted? The answer begins with the architecture of light deprivation. Windowless and daylight-deprived housing does not arise from architectural oversight. It is the outcome of deliberate spatial strategies that maximize every rentable square meter within the constraints of urban land and code. Four main typologies dominate this landscape. The semi-basement apartment, known in Seoul as banjiha, occupies a space partly below grade, often with windows set just above the sidewalk or facing narrow light wells. These units are carved from the lowest level of a building, relying on minimal openings or mechanical systems for air and illumination. In Tokyo and other dense Asian cities, the interior room typology appears in high-rise floor plans as bedrooms or studios located entirely within the building's core, separated from the exterior by corridors and other units, with no direct access to windows. These spaces depend on artificial lighting and forced air ventilation, sometimes borrowing faint daylight through glass panels in doors or transom windows along shared halls. A third form is the subdivided corridor apartment, where larger perimeter units are split so that interior rooms or micro-bedrooms are created deep inside the floor plate, accessible only via long passageways. The fourth is the so-called borrowed light unit, where a single window in a distant living area is expected to serve multiple interior rooms through open-plan layouts or partial partitions, resulting in uneven distribution of natural light. In all these cases, the privilege of the perimeter, access to daylight, views, and direct ventilation becomes a scarce commodity, reserved for a shrinking share of units. The rest are designed around the logic of the core, where the absence of windows is not a flaw, but a calculated response to density and cost. This architecture of light deprivation makes clear that the physical form of housing is dictated as much by economic and regulatory pressures as by the basic needs of its occupants. Land values in central Seoul and Tokyo now reach extraordinary heights: 200 million won per square meter in Seoul's Gangnam district, and 1.2 million yen per square meter in Tokyo's core wards. At these levels, every additional square meter of floor area represents a significant financial stake. Floor area ratio caps, often set at 4.0 in both cities' densest zones, strictly limit how much building mass can be constructed on a given plot. Developers, seeking to maximize return, turn to the building's interior. By allocating 10 to 20% of a project's gross floor area to windowless or semi-basement units, they can increase the volume of rentable apartments without breaching regulatory envelopes. An urban economist describes the calculation. Interior units lacking exterior walls and windows are 15 to 25% cheaper to construct. There is no need for expensive facade treatments, high-performance glazing, or weatherproofing. Internal partitions and basic finishes suffice. For a typical high-rise, this cost advantage, when combined with the ability to rent out more units, can lift project profit margins by 5 to 8%, even if these apartments rent at a 30 to 50% discount compared to daylight units. For tenants, the trade-off is stark. While the headline rent is lower, the rent-to-income ratio for these units remains high, often between 45 and 60% of median household income in Seoul's core districts, and 42 to 58% in Tokyo. The discount, in effect, reflects not a true affordability gain, but a recalibration of minimum living standards under urban land pressure. Windowless and semi-basement housing becomes not an aberration, but an economically rational product of the system's underlying logic. Zoning and building codes in Seoul and Tokyo do not simply tolerate windowless apartments, they provide explicit technical pathways for their approval. In both cities, the legal definition of a habitable room once rested on the presence of natural light and direct ventilation. Over time, statutory clauses have carved out exemptions, transforming what was once a hard boundary into a negotiable threshold. A zoning analyst describes how these exemptions work. In Seoul, the building code requires that at least 10% of a unit's floor area be glazed, with a daylight factor of no less than 0.85% at the window. Tokyo's standard is similar, mandating 8% glazing and a daylight factor of 0.7%. But the code also allows a developer to waive these minimums if a certified mechanical ventilation system delivers at least 0.5 air changes per hour and maintains indoor carbon dioxide below 1,000 parts per million. This ventilation waiver, formalized in amendments like Seoul's 1998 Housing Act and Tokyo's 2002 Building Standard Law revision, creates a compliance route for interior units. The process requires engineering certification and periodic maintenance checks, but it permits entire apartments to forego windows altogether. Fire egress is addressed through protected stairwells and smoke-controlled corridors, yet no direct egress window is required for these interior spaces. Legal status for basement dwellings has also shifted. Seoul's 2015 amendment and Tokyo's 2018 regulation allowed semi-basement conversions if ventilation, moisture, and fire standards are met. These code structures do not merely allow interior units, they actively shape the market by defining the minimum environmental quality that can be traded for affordability. The result is a system where daylight and fresh air become variables in a regulatory formula rather than universal rights for residents. Illuminance levels in windowless and semi-basement apartments rarely exceed 150 lux at eye level, a fraction of the 300 lux required to sustain normal circadian rhythms. According to a public health researcher, this sensory deficit is not merely a discomfort, it is a quantifiable risk. Chronobiological studies in Seoul and Tokyo have documented that residents of these units experience delayed melatonin onset by 1 to 2 hours, resulting in persistent sleep phase disorders and chronic fatigue. The biological disruption extends beyond sleep. Epidemiological surveys reveal that the prevalence of seasonal affective disorder is 1.5 to 2 times higher among occupants of interior units compared to those in daylight access apartments. In a 2022 study of 3,200 households in Seoul, 12% of Banjiha residents reported clinically significant symptoms of seasonal affective disorder, nearly double the rate observed in conventional units. Respiratory health is also affected. Mechanical ventilation systems, while meeting code on paper, often fall short in practice due to irregular maintenance. Inadequate air exchange leads to elevated indoor humidity, commonly between 65 and 80%, and carbon dioxide concentrations that frequently exceed 1,200 parts per million during peak occupancy. These conditions create an environment where mold thrives. Surveys estimate that 22% of semi-basement apartments in Seoul's older housing stock exhibit visible mold growth on walls or ceilings. The resulting exposure is linked to increased rates of allergic reactions and respiratory complaints among residents. The aggregate effect of these deficits is not limited to individual well-being. Productivity loss from disrupted sleep and mood disorders among interior unit residents is estimated at over $1 billion annually in Seoul alone. Direct healthcare expenditures for respiratory conditions add hundreds of millions more. The public health researcher stresses that these figures reflect a systemic cost embedded in the economic logic that drives the proliferation of windowless housing. Mechanical ventilation stands in for the absent window, but it is neither passive nor free. An environmental engineer describes the system. Centralized fans draw in filtered outdoor air, distribute it through ducts, and exhaust stale air from each interior unit. This process is constant, consuming roughly 120 kilowatt-hours per square meter each year, nearly double the 70 kilowatt-hours needed for naturally ventilated daylight units. The difference is not trivial. It translates to higher building energy loads and increased service charges for tenants. Reliability is another concern. Municipal surveys in Seoul and Tokyo report that 18% of windowless units experience at least one ventilation failure per year, often due to clogged filters or worn fan motors. When a system fails, indoor air quality deteriorates rapidly, with carbon dioxide levels rising above safe thresholds within half an hour. The engineer emphasizes that these systems require disciplined maintenance, yet the burden of upkeep often falls to building managers with limited resources. In effect, the promise of fresh air is delivered only as long as the machinery runs and the maintenance schedule is kept, a dependency that is built into the economics of every interior unit. A windowless apartment in Tokyo's Shibuya ward rents for 70,000 yen per month, while a comparable daylight unit in the same building commands 108,000 yen. The 35% discount is not simply a reflection of lower quality, but a direct trade-off between environmental standards and immediate cash flow. For tenants, this lower rent can mean the difference between access to a central location and being priced out entirely. The appeal is immediate: a smaller monthly payment, more money left for other expenses, and a foothold in the urban core. Yet the savings are realized up front. The costs, reduced comfort, health, and long-term productivity are deferred or hidden. The market logic rewards short-term affordability, even as it pushes the risks of diminished living standards into the background. Flood events in Seoul have exposed the physical vulnerability of semi-basement housing. The 2022 flash flood alone caused $750 million in damage, with thousands of Banjiha units rendered uninhabitable by water intrusion and power loss. Safety assessments reveal that interior units, particularly those without direct egress, face extended evacuation times in emergencies. Fire modeling shows that residents of windowless core apartments require an average of 84 seconds to reach a protected stairwell, twice as long as those in exterior units, who exit in 42 seconds. As developers push the share of interior units beyond 20% of a building's gross floor area, municipal data registers a marked increase in incident rates. Fire-related injuries rise by 7%, and flood damage claims by 5% above baseline. These figures define a clear boundary where the logic of optimization collides with the limits of safety, and where policy intervention becomes unavoidable. As urban land pressure intensifies, daylight and fresh air remain negotiable assets, priced, regulated, and rationed by policy. The threshold of what constitutes adequate shelter is not fixed, and it shifts with each regulatory and economic decision. The minimum standard is always up for debate.